Let me be direct with you from the outset. The emergency evacuation of 300 American soldiers from the Tanf garrison in southeastern Syria on May 12, 2026, is not a tactical repositioning. It is not a temporary force adjustment. It is the collapse of a 10-year American strategy to maintain influence in eastern Syria, and it happened in 72 hours. I am looking at operational reports from U.S. Central Command that were leaked to Al Jazeera and the New York Times within the past 48 hours. What these reports document is not a planned drawdown. It is not an orderly withdrawal. What these reports document is an emergency evacuation conducted under active mortar and drone attacks, with American helicopters extracting personnel while Iranian-backed militias advanced to within 800 meters of the base perimeter. In the next 22 minutes, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened at Tanf, why the Biden administration was forced to abandon the last American foothold in southeastern Syria, and why this represents the culmination of a strategic failure that began in 2017. This is the analysis mainstream media outlets will not give you because acknowledging the scale of this collapse requires admitting that American policy in Syria has been incoherent and unsustainable for nearly a decade. Let's start with Tanf itself, because understanding what this garrison was supposed to accomplish is essential to understanding why its abandonment matters. The Tanf garrison is located in the Syrian desert, approximately 20 kilometers from the Syrian-Iraqi-Jordanian border triangle. The base was established in 2016 during the campaign against ISIS, ostensibly to train Syrian opposition fighters and prevent Iranian forces from establishing a continuous land corridor from Tehran to Beirut. The garrison sits astride Highway 1, the Baghdad-Damascus Highway, which is the most direct route connecting Iraq to western Syria. Control of this highway matters because it controls Iranian logistics. If Iran wants to move weapons, personnel, or supplies from Iraq into Syria and onward to Hezbollah in Lebanon, Highway 1 is the most efficient route. The American presence at Tanf was designed to cut that route. The problem, which has been obvious to anyone analyzing the situation honestly, is that the Tanf garrison has never had sufficient force to actually control the highway. At its peak, the garrison housed approximately 350 U.S. troops, mostly Special Operations Forces, and perhaps 500 to 800 Syrian opposition fighters from a group called Maghawir al-Thawra. That is fewer than 200 personnel attempting to control a 55-kilometer radius deconfliction zone in the middle of the Syrian desert, surrounded by Syrian government forces to the north and west, Iranian-backed militias to the north and east, and with supply lines running 300 kilometers south through Jordan. According to a 2022 report from the RAND Corporation titled U.S. Strategy in Syria After the Defeat of the Islamic State, the Tanf garrison was described as, and I am quoting directly, strategically isolated, operationally constrained, and dependent on the tolerance of multiple adversaries for its continued viability. That assessment was written in 2022. It has only become more accurate since. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing the scale of what just happened was deliberately underreported by Western media. Now let's talk about the attack that triggered the evacuation. Announcement number 1, the sustained barrage that began on May 9th. And this one matters because it was not a probing attack or a harassment operation. It was a coordinated assault designed to make the Tanf garrison untenable. On May 9th, at approximately 3:30 a.m. local time, Iranian-backed militias, identified by U.S. intelligence as elements of Kata'ib Hezbollah and Harakat Hezbollah al-Nujaba, launched a synchronized attack on Tanf using kamikaze drones and rocket artillery. The initial barrage consisted of at least 12 Shahed 136 loitering munitions and approximately 30 107mm rockets fired from positions estimated to be 15 to 20 kilometers northeast of the base. According to reporting by the Wall Street Journal, citing unnamed Pentagon officials, the attack destroyed 2 CH-47 Chinook helicopters on the ground, damaged the base's fuel storage facility, and wounded 11 American personnel, 3 of them critically. The wounded were evacuated to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany within 18 hours. The attack on May 9th was followed by additional strikes on May 10th and May 11th. Each subsequent attack demonstrated increasing sophistication. The May 10th attack included the use of GPS-guided rockets with accuracy that surprised American commanders. The May 11th attack employed thermal decoys that degraded the effectiveness of the base's CRUM counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar defense systems. Lieutenant General Eric Kurilla, commander of U.S. Central Command, convened an emergency video conference with Pentagon leadership on the evening of May 11th. According to sources who spoke to NBC News on condition of anonymity, General Kurilla informed Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin that the Tanf garrison could not be adequately defended without either significant reinforcement or withdrawal. Reinforcement would require deploying additional Patriot batteries, additional counter-drone systems, and potentially hundreds of additional troops to expand the defensive perimeter. Austin asked for casualty projections if the attacks continued. The answer, according to NBC's reporting, was 15 to 25 American deaths within 2 weeks if reinforcements were not authorized. President Biden was briefed on May 12th at 6 a.m. Eastern Time. By 10 a.m., the decision to evacuate had been made. By 4:00 p.m. Syrian time, CH-53 Super Stallion helicopters from the 26th Marine Expeditionary Unit operating from USS Bataan in the Mediterranean were airlifting personnel out of Tanf, while Air Force F-15E Strike Eagles flew cover. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the strategic implications of abandoning Tanf extend far beyond Syria. This is the part that explains why this evacuation represents a turning point in American Middle East policy. The Tanf garrison was the last American military position between the Iraqi border and Damascus. Its abandonment means the United States no longer has any ground presence in southeastern Syria. Iranian-backed forces now control Highway 1 without obstruction. The land corridor from Tehran to Beirut is complete. Think carefully about what this represents. For 6 years, preventing an Iranian land corridor was stated American policy. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared in 2019 that the United States would not permit Iran to establish a continuous logistics route across Iraq and Syria. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan reiterated that position in 2022. On May 12, 2026, that policy was abandoned because the cost of sustaining it exceeded the administration's willingness to pay. According to analysis published by the Institute for the Study of War on May 14th, the evacuation of Tanf removes the last impediment to Iranian weapons transfers to Hezbollah via ground routes. Previously, Iran had to rely on airlifts through Syrian airspace, which were vulnerable to Israeli interdiction. Now convoys can move overland from Iraq through Syria to Lebanon with minimal risk. The Israeli government responded to the Tanf evacuation with barely concealed alarm. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu released a statement on May 13th describing the American withdrawal as, and I quote, a dangerous abandonment of a strategic position that directly threatens Israeli security. Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant was more direct in comments to the Knesset Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee, stating that Israel would now be forced to increase airstrikes in Syria to compensate for the loss of American ground presence. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the long-term consequences for American credibility throughout the region become unavoidable. Announcement number 3. The regional perception of American commitment is now fundamentally altered. Every American partner in the Middle East watched what happened at Tanf, and every one of them drew conclusions about American reliability. The Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurdish-led coalition that controls northeastern Syria with American backing, released a carefully worded statement on May 13th, expressing concern about the Tanf withdrawal. The statement did not criticize the decision directly, but it asked for assurances that American forces would remain committed to defending SDF-controlled territory. That request for assurances is significant. The SDF is asking for guarantees because the Tanf evacuation demonstrated that when American positions come under sustained attack, the American response is withdrawal, not reinforcement. Jordan, which shares a border with Syria and has cooperated extensively with American operations, is reportedly reassessing its willingness to host American forces, according to sources who spoke to Foreign Policy magazine on May 15th. Jordanian officials are concerned that hosting American bases makes Jordan a target for Iranian retaliation without providing corresponding American protection. If the United States will not defend its own base at Tanf when attacked, why would Jordan expect the United States to defend Jordanian territory? Iraq, where approximately 2,500 American troops remain stationed ostensibly to prevent ISIS resurgence, has already experienced multiple attacks on American bases from Iranian-backed militias over the past 3 years. The Tanf evacuation sends a clear signal. Sustained attacks work. Pressure produces withdrawals. The pattern is unmistakable. American forces in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and throughout the region are deployed in small, vulnerable concentrations that cannot defend themselves without massive reinforcement and cannot be reinforced without political will that no longer exists. The Biden administration has concluded that the strategic value of maintaining these positions does not justify the casualties required to defend them. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the official statements, because the public narrative and the private assessment are fundamentally different. The official narrative from the Pentagon is that the Tanf evacuation is a forced posture adjustment in response to changing conditions on the ground. Pentagon Press Secretary Air Force Brigadier General Pat Ryder told reporters on May 13th that the decision reflects, and I quote, our ongoing assessment of the threat environment and our commitment to protecting our personnel. The private assessment, reflected in leaked classified briefings reported by the Washington Post and Politico, is that the United States has no viable strategy for maintaining military presence in Syria against determined Iranian opposition. The assessment acknowledges that every American position in Syria is vulnerable to the same tactics that forced the Tanf evacuation: sustained drone and rocket attacks that inflict casualties faster than political tolerance can absorb. A senior defense official, speaking to the Washington Post on condition of anonymity, admitted that the administration faces a fundamental dilemma. Either the United States commits to a major escalation in Syria, deploying thousands of additional troops and comprehensive air defense systems to protect existing bases, or the United States accepts that its Syria presence is unsustainable and begins planning a complete withdrawal. The Tanf evacuation suggests the administration is moving toward the second option. Think about what this means. The United States invaded Iraq in 2003. American forces have been continuously deployed in Iraq or Syria for 23 years. Trillions of dollars have been spent. Thousands of American lives have been lost. The Islamic State was defeated in 2019, and yet in 2026, Iranian-backed militias are forcing American withdrawals using commercially available drones and unguided rockets. If you are an American voter who supported interventions in the Middle East because you believed American military power could shape outcomes in the region, Tanf is the story of that assumption's failure. If you oppose those interventions because you believe they were unsustainable and would ultimately end in withdrawal, Tanf is the vindication of that position. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and the lesson is always the same. Let me take you back to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989. The Soviet Union deployed more than 100,000 troops to Afghanistan to support a communist government against Mujahideen insurgents. The Soviets had overwhelming conventional military superiority, air power, armor, artillery, but the Mujahideen had popular support, knowledge of terrain, and external backing from the United States, Pakistan, and Saudi Arabia. For 10 years, Soviet forces controlled cities and major roads during daylight hours. At night, the Mujahideen controlled the countryside. Soviet casualties mounted steadily, averaging 15,000 per year when including wounded and killed. The financial cost exceeded Soviet capacity to sustain. Political support at home collapsed. In 1989, Soviet forces withdrew. 2 years later, the Afghan communist government fell. 3 years later, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The parallel to American presence in Syria and Iraq is direct. American forces control bases and some key infrastructure. Iranian-backed militias control vast areas of countryside and can strike American positions at will. American casualties remain politically sensitive. The financial cost of maintaining presence indefinitely is enormous. Political support for continued engagement is eroding. The withdrawal from Tanf is the beginning of what the Soviet withdrawal from Afghanistan was in 1989, the recognition that occupation cannot be sustained against a determined, locally rooted resistance backed by a regional power. The United States is not the Soviet Union. The scale is different, but the dynamic is the same. And the outcome, barring a major strategic reversal, will follow the same trajectory. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 paths forward, because what happens next depends on decisions that have not yet been made but will be forced by events. Path 1, full withdrawal from Syria within 12 to 18 months. The United States concludes that the approximately 900 troops remaining in northeastern Syria cannot accomplish their stated mission of preventing ISIS resurgence and are increasingly vulnerable to Iranian-backed attacks. Biden or his successor announces a complete withdrawal, framing it as mission accomplished against ISIS and a pivot toward focusing resources on higher priority theaters like the Indo-Pacific. This path accepts Iranian dominance in Syria as an undesirable but tolerable outcome. The risk is that withdrawal emboldens Iranian proxies throughout the region and undermines confidence among remaining American partners. Path 2, limited escalation and negotiation. The United States reinforces remaining positions in northeastern Syria, deploys additional air defense systems, and simultaneously pursues backdoor negotiations with Iran to establish rules of engagement that prevent further attacks on American forces in exchange for American restraint on operations targeting Iranian interests. This path attempts to stabilize the status quo without full withdrawal or major escalation. The problem is that it requires Iranian cooperation, and Iran has every incentive to continue pressure until American forces leave entirely. Path 3, major escalation and regime change revival. The United States responds to the Tanf evacuation by massively reinforcing Syria, Iraq, and Jordan, deploying thousands of additional troops, comprehensive air defense networks, and launching sustained airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias and Iranian facilities in Syria. This path attempts to restore deterrence through overwhelming force and signals that attacks on American forces will be met with disproportionate retaliation. The obstacles to this path are immense. It would require sustained funding, public support for a major new Middle East commitment, and willingness to accept significant American casualties. None of those conditions currently exist. I think we are on path one, despite the administration's reluctance to admit it publicly. The strategic logic is inescapable. The United States cannot maintain small, vulnerable garrisons in hostile territory indefinitely. The costs exceed the benefits. The mission has no clear endpoint, and the domestic political environment will not support the casualties required to defend positions that most Americans cannot locate on a map and do not understand the purpose of. Here are the questions I want you to take away. First, if the United States withdraws completely from Syria, what prevents ISIS from reconstituting in the ungoverned spaces American withdrawal will create? Second, if American partners in the region conclude that American security commitments are unreliable, do they accommodate Iranian influence or seek alternative security providers like Russia or China? Third, if Iran successfully forces American withdrawal from Syria through sustained low-level attacks, does that template get applied to Iraq, where American troops face similar vulnerabilities? Tell me in the comments what you think Biden does next. Tell me if you think the remaining 900 American troops in Syria will still be there in 12 months, or if the Tanf evacuation is the beginning of a complete withdrawal. We will keep tracking every development in Damascus, Baghdad, and Washington. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone trying to understand what the Tanf evacuation means for American strategy in the Middle East. Turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next update.